The thing about illegal fighting circuits is that they tend to attract the galaxy's most discerning connoisseurs of violence, which is to say beings with more credits than sense, and a disturbing fascination with watching other creatures pummel each other into unrecognizable paste. Proxima Station's underground arena had achieved something of a reputation in this regard, boasting fights so spectacularly brutal that even the Galactic Ethics Committee had given up filing complaints and simply added the station to their places we pretend don't exist list. Tonight's crowd represented a delightful cross-section of civilized society's finest specimens. Regalian bone merchants sat shoulder to shoulder with Centaurian flesh traders, while a particularly odorous group of Zephyrian scavengers had claimed the cheap seats near what passed for ventilation. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation and the distinctive aroma of 17 different species' nervous perspiration, a bouquet that would have made a perfumer weep, though whether from inspiration or horror remained unclear. The betting pools, managed by an enterprising Ferengi, who had somehow convinced 3 different governments that he didn't exist, displayed odds that would have been considered insulting if they weren't so laughably optimistic. The evening's main attraction, a bipedal mammal from the recently discovered Sol system, commanded odds so astronomical that several mathematicians had been consulted to ensure the numbers could actually be displayed on standard holographic equipment. 100 to 1 against the human, wheezed a particularly corpulent hut, its translator struggling with what appeared to be snickering. Might as well bet on a newborn grub defeating a fusion reactor. The subject of this derision stood in the arena's center, and to the untrained observer, the hut's assessment seemed devastatingly accurate. Where her opponents typically boasted natural armor plating, redundant organ systems, or the ability to regenerate lost limbs, the human appeared to have been designed by a committee of pessimists. No claws, no fangs, no protective carapace, just pale pink skin that looked like it might bruise if someone stared at it too hard. This assessment of apparent human fragility was interrupted by the arrival of a figure that caused the arena's ambient noise to drop by several decibels. Khan Vorthak, supreme ruler of the Crimson Nebula Empire and conqueror of 47 star systems, had decided to grace the proceedings with his presence. The Khan stood nearly 3 meters tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming with the kind of polish that suggested entire planet's GDP had been allocated to his personal grooming budget. Forearms moved with predatory grace, while compound eyes surveyed the arena with the casual indifference of someone who owned several solar systems and wasn't particularly impressed by any of them. Fascinating, the Khan rumbled, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his casual observations treated as imperial decrees. I was under the impression this establishment featured combat, not elaborate suicide ritual. His entourage, a collection of military advisors, court sycophants, and what appeared to be a professional food taster, laughed with the precise timing that indicated either extensive rehearsal or genuine terror. The Khan himself, however, seemed oddly fixated on the human in the arena below. The human's first opponent emerged from the competitor tunnel with all the subtlety of a geological event. The Regalian bone crusher stood 4 meters tall and massed approximately as much as a small shuttlecraft, its crystalline hide refracting the arena lights into prismatic displays that were genuinely beautiful right up until you remembered those same crystals could probably slice through starship hulls. The creature's intelligence was generally considered to be somewhere between that of a particularly dim asteroid and a moderately clever thermostat. But in fairness, when you possessed enough raw crushing power to compact a hover car into a decorative paperweight, advanced cognitive abilities seemed somewhat redundant. The fight began with what could charitably be described as the Regalian's opening gambit, a straightforward charge that demonstrated all the tactical sophistication of a meteorite impact. The human, displaying what several spectators would later describe as either supreme confidence or a complete dissociation from reality, didn't move. At least, not until the last possible moment. What happened next would be analyzed by xenobiologists for decades. The human didn't simply dodge. She seemed to flow around the Regalian's attack like water finding the path of least resistance, one hand trailing across the creature's flank as she passed. The Regalian, suddenly finding itself grappling with empty air instead of soft mammalian flesh, stumbled with all the grace of a collapsing space station. Interesting, Khan Vorthak observed, leaning forward slightly. The creature appears to understand physics. The human had rolled behind her opponent and was now studying the Regalian's crystal formation with the focused attention of someone solving a particularly engaging puzzle. When the bone crusher turned, bellowing its confusion at the arena's ceiling, she was already moving again, not away, but closer, her small hands pressing against specific points on the creature's back. The Regalian's bellow cut off abruptly as several key crystal matrices suddenly found themselves slightly out of alignment. The creature swayed, its massive frame no longer quite sure which direction gravity was pulling, and then toppled forward with a crash that caused the arena's structural engineers to frantically check their stress calculation. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet typically associated with the moments after someone accidentally insults a armed deity. The human stood beside her fallen opponent, apparently uninjured and looking mildly disappointed, as if she'd been hoping for something more challenging. Con Vorthak's compound eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement, or possibly hunger. "How delightfully unexpected," he murmured. "The soft-skinned mammal appears to possess a brain." The intermission following the Regalian's spectacular horizontal demonstration lasted precisely long enough for the arena's medical team to determine that the bone crusher wasn't dead, merely suffering from what the chief medic diplomatically termed acute crystalline realignment syndrome. The betting pools, meanwhile, underwent what economists would later classify as a controlled panic, with odds shifting faster than a quantum accountant's ethic. The human's second opponent represented a marked escalation in the evening's entertainment, assuming one considered the prospect of witnessing advanced cybernetic warfare to be entertaining rather than deeply concerning. The Zephyrian gladiator that emerged from the competitor tunnel bore only a passing resemblance to its organic origins, having undergone enough technological enhancement to qualify as either a heavily modified life form or a particularly sophisticated war machine, depending on one's philosophical leanings regarding the nature of consciousness. Con Vorthak observed with the tone of someone recognizing a familiar vintage of violence. Now this should prove educational. The Zephyrian's enhancements followed the traditional approach to combat optimization. If some technology was good, then a ridiculous amount of technology was presumably better. Servo-assisted limbs provided strength that could crush starship bulkheads, while neural processing implants calculated trajectory paths with the precision of a navigation computer. Its vision had been augmented across 17 different spectrums, and its reaction time had been reduced to levels that made hummingbirds appear sluggish by comparison. In short, it represented everything that galactic military doctrine considered to be the pinnacle of individual combat effectiveness. The fact that it was about to fight a creature whose primary technological advancement appeared to be opposable thumbs struck most observers as less a contest than an elaborate method of organic waste disposal. The human, for her part, seemed remarkably unimpressed by her opponent's technological superiority. She circled the Zephyrian with the patient attention of someone window shopping, her gaze moving between the creature's various mechanical enhancements, with what appeared to be professional interest rather than appropriate terror. The Zephyrian struck with the kind of calculated precision that made computer-assisted warfare possible. Its enhanced reflexes identified the optimal attack vector, its servos provided the necessary force, and its targeting systems tracked the human's movement with mathematical certainty. Unfortunately for the Zephyrian, mathematics had apparently failed to account for the human's approach to personal physics. Rather than attempting to avoid the attack through conventional evasion, which would have been impossible given the speed differential, the human did something that caused several spectators to question whether they'd properly understood the basic laws of motion. She moved into the attack, her body twisting in a way that seemed to violate at least 3 fundamental principles of biomechanics, and somehow managed to redirect the Zephyrian's momentum in a direction that its targeting computer had never been programmed to anticipate. "Fascinating," the Khan murmured, as the cybernetically enhanced gladiator found itself embedded in the arena wall with a sound like expensive equipment achieving an unscheduled disassembly. "The creature appears to understand that technology is only as effective as the assumptions underlying its programming." What followed could best be described as a practical demonstration in the limitations of artificial intelligence, when confronted with naturally occurring irrationality. The Zephyrian's combat algorithms had been designed to counter every known fighting style in the Galactic database, but apparently no one had thought to program responses for an opponent who seemed to treat the laws of physics as friendly suggestions rather than absolute constraints. The human's combat approach defied categorization within established martial taxonomies. Where Rigelian combat doctrine emphasized overwhelming force, and Centaurian technique focused on surgical precision, the human appeared to be inventing new principles of violence in real time. She used the arena itself as a weapon, turning walls into launching platforms and gravity into an ally. When the Zephyrian attempted to corner her, she somehow managed to use its own enhanced reflexes against it, triggering defensive responses that left the creature fighting empty air, while she repositioned for her next inexplicable maneuver. But perhaps most unsettling to the assembled spectators was the human's apparent psychological warfare capability. She spoke to her opponent throughout the fight, not the ritual boasting common to most combat species, but a running commentary that seemed designed to undermine the Zephyrian's confidence in its own technological superiority. Your left servo's running about 3 milliseconds behind your right, she observed conversationally while somehow managing to be in 2 places at once. Might want to have that looked at. The Zephyrian's response, a series of electronic bleeps that the translator diplomatically rendered anatomically improbable suggestions, was interrupted when the human demonstrated that she'd been correct about the servo timing issue by exploiting the delay to position herself precisely where the creature's own enhanced strength could be turned against its structural integrity. The crowd's reaction evolved from initial mockery through genuine concern and was now approaching something resembling religious awe. The Rigelian bone merchants had stopped taking bets and were instead frantically taking note. The Centaurian flesh traders were engaging in heated discussions about the potential market value of human combat techniques. Even the Zephyrian scavengers had temporarily stopped smelling terrible, apparently too fascinated to maintain their usual biological function. Khan Vorthak, however, was no longer watching the fight. Instead, his compound eyes were fixed on the human's face, studying her expression with the intensity of someone attempting to solve a particularly complex equation. What he saw there was neither the bloodlust typical of successful gladiators, nor the desperate determination of creatures fighting for survival. Instead, she appeared to be enjoying herself in the way that indicated she found her opponent intellectually stimulating rather than physically threatening. "Remarkable," the Khan said softly, his voice carrying a note that his advisors recognized as dangerous curiosity. "The creature treats combat as a form of problem-solving rather than simple violence. How refreshingly civilized." The fight's conclusion came with the inevitability of a mathematical proof reaching its logical conclusion. The Zephyrian, its systems overloaded by the effort of trying to predict an opponent who seemed to operate according to her own private physics, finally experienced what its diagnostic systems reported as a cascade failure of predictive algorithm. In more practical terms, it fell over and began making the electronic equivalent of confused whimpering. The human stood over her fallen opponent, apparently unmarked by the encounter, and looked up at the VIP section where Khan Vorthak sat watching. For a moment their eyes met across the arena, and something passed between them that caused the Khan's advisors to exchange nervous glances. "Prepare a formal invitation," the Khan said quietly. "It appears I have business to discuss with our evening's entertainment." The championship bout was scheduled with all the pomp and circumstance that illegal underground fighting circuits could muster, which is to say it featured marginally better lighting and someone had apparently convinced a janitor to mop up the more obvious bloodstains. The arena's proprietor, sensing that they were witnessing something that would either make their careers or result in their immediate execution by several different galactic authorities, had pulled out all the stops for what promised to be either a historic upset or a very expensive form of public execution. The human's final opponent represented the kind of evolutionary achievement that made xenobiologists weep with professional envy. The Vorthan gladiator had been bred specifically for arena combat over 17 generations, resulting in a creature that combined the best aspects of a main battle tank with the personal charm of a fusion explosion. Standing nearly 5 meters tall and massing approximately as much as a small moon, it possessed natural armor plating that had been field-tested against plasma artillery, redundant cardiovascular systems that could function independently, and reflexes that had been honed through a childhood consisting entirely of supervised violence. More importantly, it possessed something that the previous opponents had lacked: genuine intelligence. The Vorthen studied its human opponent with the calculating attention of a creature that had learned to treat every fight as a chess match played with other people's internal organs. Khan Vorthak leaned forward in his observation platform, his forearms arranged in what his advisors recognized as the posture indicating deep contemplation. The Khan was experiencing something that his species rarely encountered, uncertainty about an outcome. His empire had been built on the principle that superior force, properly applied, could solve any problem the universe cared to present. Yet watching the humans' previous fights had introduced a troubling variable into his worldview, the possibility that intelligence might occasionally trump raw power. "My lord," ventured his chief military advisor, a scarred veteran whose tactical acumen had conquered 3-star systems. "Surely the Vorthen's advantages are insurmountable. The human creature, while interesting, cannot possibly overcome such disparity in physical capabilities." The Khan's compound eyes remained fixed on the arena floor, where the human was conducting what appeared to be a geological survey of the fighting surface. "Tell me, General," he said softly, "what is the most dangerous quality a ruler can possess?" The question caught the advisor off guard, as philosophical inquiries during gladiatorial events were generally considered poor form. "Ruthlessness, my lord. The willingness to make difficult decisions. Predictability," the Khan corrected. "A predictable ruler can be countered, outmaneuvered, eventually defeated. But a ruler who operates according to principles that others cannot anticipate." He gestured toward the human with one of his secondary arms. "Such a ruler becomes effectively unconquerable." The fight began with the Vorthen demonstrating why 17 generations of selective breeding had been considered a worthwhile investment. Its opening assault combined tactical sophistication with overwhelming force, creating a pattern of attacks that should have left its opponent with approximately the same life expectancy as a snowball in a fusion reactor. The human's response was to do something that caused the arena's structural engineers to frantically recalculate load-bearing specifications. Rather than attempting to avoid the Vorthen's attacks, she began using the environment as an extension of her own capability. The arena walls became launching platforms, the lighting fixtures became improvised weapons, and the floor itself seemed to cooperate with her movements in ways that suggested she'd somehow negotiated a private treaty with the local gravitational field. But it was her psychological approach that truly distinguished this fight from the previous encounters, where she had used conversation to unsettle her earlier opponents. With the Vorthen she employed silence as a weapon. Each time the gladiator expected a response, verbal acknowledgement of a successful hit, cries of pain, or the traditional pre-death boasting, the human provided nothing. Her silence transformed the arena into a vacuum that the Vorthen's expectations couldn't fill. "She's making it fight itself," Khan Vorthak observed with something approaching reverence. "The creature's intelligence becomes a liability because it requires feedback to function effectively." "Brilliant." The Vorthen, increasingly frustrated by its inability to predict or even properly categorize its opponent's behavior, began making the kind of tactical errors that would have horrified its 17 generations of carefully bred ancestors. It overextended attacks that should have been conservative probes, committed to strategies that required assumptions about human behavior that proved spectacularly incorrect, and gradually found itself fighting not one opponent, but its own expectations about how combat should function. The human, meanwhile, appeared to be conducting an advanced seminar in applied xenobiology. Each exchange revealed new information about Vorthen physiology, psychology, and combat doctrine, which she then immediately incorporated into her strategy. She wasn't simply fighting her opponent, she was learning it, understanding it, and then using that understanding to make the creature defeat itself. Khan Vorthak found himself confronting a realization that threatened the fundamental assumptions underlying his empire. For 3 centuries, the Crimson Nebula had expanded through the application of superior military technology and overwhelming force. His species had conquered 47 star systems by being stronger, faster, and more ruthlessly efficient than their opponent. Yet here was a creature from a species that shouldn't even qualify for galactic civilization membership, demonstrating that intelligence properly applied could neutralize advantages that seemed mathematically insurmountable. The fight's climax came when the human did something that violated several basic principles of combat doctrine, by using the Vorthen's own superior strength to generate the force necessary for its defeat.
She positioned herself in such a way that the gladiator's most powerful attack became the mechanism of its own downfall, transforming 17 generations of selective breeding into a liability rather than an advantage. The Vorthin fell with the kind of finality that suggested its ancestors were probably spinning in their ceremonial burial pods. The human stood over her defeated opponent, unmarked by the encounter, and looked up at the VIP section where Khan Vorthak sat in contemplative silence. For several minutes the arena remained quiet except for the sounds of various species trying to process what they had witnessed. The betting pools had achieved something approaching mathematical impossibility, with odds that required entirely new forms of notation. The medical teams were engaged in heated discussions about whether treating the Vorthin's condition fell under their insurance coverage. But Khan Vorthak was no longer thinking about the fight. Instead he was contemplating the future of his empire, and the uncomfortable realization that everything he had built might be fundamentally obsolete. His species had achieved dominance through superior physical capabilities and advanced technology, but what happened when confronted by opponents who operated according to entirely different principles? Fascinating, he murmured, rising from his seat with the deliberate movement of someone who had reached a decision that would change the course of galactic history. It appears I have been approaching the question of succession from entirely the wrong perspective. His advisors exchanged glances that conveyed their shared recognition that their supreme ruler had just experienced what philosophers called an paradigm shift, and what military strategists generally referred to as a very dangerous moment in imperial history. My lord, the chief advisor ventured carefully. Khan Vorthak was already moving toward the exit, his forearms gesturing for his entourage to follow. Arrange a private meeting, he commanded. It seems I have an empire to give away. The private meeting chamber aboard Khan Vorthak's flagship had been designed to impress visiting dignitaries, which meant it featured enough gold plating to fund several small wars and architectural elements that seemed to exist primarily to remind guests that the Khan possessed both unlimited resources and questionable taste in interior decoration. The human, still wearing her arena combat attire, and displaying the kind of calm alertness that suggested she was cataloging the room's tactical possibilities, seemed remarkably unimpressed by the display of imperial wealth. Your universal translator may experience some difficulty with what I am about to propose. The Khan began, settling his considerable bulk into a throne that had been carved from a single asteroid, and upholstered with what appeared to be the hide of something that had died very expensively. The concepts involved do not translate well into most galactic languages. The human raised an eyebrow, a facial expression that the Khan's xenobiological databases informed him indicated either curiosity or skepticism, though in this case it might reasonably have indicated both. Try me, she said, with the tone of someone who had learned not to be surprised by the universe's capacity for delivering unexpected complications. I wish to offer you my empire. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that typically preceded either religious revelations or catastrophic explosions. The universal translator as predict began making the electronic equivalent of confused stammering, while its linguistic processors attempted to find cultural frameworks that could accommodate the concept of a galactic emperor, voluntarily abdicating to a member of a species that hadn't even achieved faster-than-light travel. I'm sorry, the human said carefully, but I think your translator just had a stroke. Could you run that by me again? Khan Vorthak leaned forward, his compound eyes reflecting the kind of earnestness that his enemies had learned to associate with imminent policy changes involving orbital bombardment. You have demonstrated qualities that my species has spent 3 centuries trying to breed, build or purchase through conquest. Intelligence that transcends conventional limitations, the ability to solve problems that others consider insoluble. Most importantly, the capacity to win through methods that others cannot predict or counter. The human's expression suggested she was rapidly recalibrating her assessment of the evening's events, from unexpected prize-fighting opportunity to potential diplomatic incident involving multiple star systems. And you think this qualifies me to run your empire? Because, the Khan said with the patient tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a particularly dense asteroid, leadership is ultimately about solving problems that others cannot solve. You have just demonstrated that you can defeat opponents who should be mathematically superior by approaching challenges from perspectives that established doctrine considers impossible. This is precisely the skill set required for effective imperial administration. What happened next could best be described as a controlled diplomatic emergency. The Khan's offer triggered automated protocols aboard approximately 17 different governmental monitoring stations, causing bureaucrats across 3 sectors to experience what medical personnel would later classify as acute jurisdictional anxiety. The Galactic Council's emergency session convened in record time, though their primary accomplishment was to establish that none of their existing regulations covered the scenario of an emperor attempting to gift-wrap his entire civilization. The human, meanwhile, was demonstrating the same problem-solving approach that had served her so well in the arena. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," she said, beginning to pace in a way that made the Khan's bodyguards nervously check their weapon charges. "You're offering me control of 47 star systems, multiple species, and what I'm assuming is a fairly complex military-industrial infrastructure, based on watching me beat up 3 guys in an underground fight club. 48 star systems." The Khan correct. "We conquered the Helix Nebula while you were fighting the Vor thing. And it wasn't the fighting that impressed me, it was your approach to problem-solving under pressure." The human stopped pacing and fixed the Khan with the kind of direct stare that had made her previous opponents deeply uncomfortable. "And what makes you think I want your empire?" This question appeared to genuinely surprise the Khan, who had apparently assumed that galactic domination represented a universal aspiration. "You don't want to rule 48 star systems. I don't even want to rule my own apartment complex, homeowners association," the human replied with feeling. "Have you seen the paperwork involved in imperial administration? The tax codes alone would require a dedicated AI just to prevent mathematical overflow error." What followed was perhaps the most unusual negotiation in recorded galactic history. The Khan, displaying the kind of desperate creativity typically associated with failing military campaigns, began offering increasingly elaborate modifications to his proposal. Shared rulership advisory positions, autonomous subsector management. Each suggestion met with the human's continued expressions of profound disinterest in the daily operations of interstellar governance. "However," she said, eventually with the tone of someone who had identified an intriguing technical challenge, "I might be interested in a consulting arrangement." The Khan's advisors began making rapid calculations involving the probable survival rates of imperial dynasties under management consulting paradigms. The results were not encouraging. "You see," the human continued, apparently oblivious to the minor bureaucratic apocalypse she was proposing, "your empire's problem isn't that you lack capable leadership, it's that you've been approaching expansion through conquest rather than cooperation. You've been trying to solve political problems with military solutions, which works right up until you encounter someone who thinks differently about the fundamental nature of the problem." The Khan found himself nodding along with what appeared to be a lecture on imperial administration theory delivered by someone who had learned about his empire's existence approximately 30 minutes earlier. "You're suggesting what exactly?" "A complete restructuring of your expansion philosophy," she said cheerfully. "Instead of conquering civilizations, why not try convincing them that joining your empire represents a better solution to their existing problems than whatever they're currently doing? People are much more cooperative when they think the arrangement was their idea."
The negotiation that followed would be studied by diplomatic historians for centuries, primarily because it represented the first recorded instance of an empire being fundamentally reorganized through the application of human-style lateral thinking. The humans' consulting contract included provisions for educational exchange programs, economic cooperation initiatives, and something called cultural sensitivity training that caused the Khan's military advisors to experience what their medical staff diagnosed as anticipatory stress disorder. 6 months later, the Crimson Nebula Empire, now officially renamed the Crimson Nebula Cooperative, had expanded to include 12 new member civilizations, none of which had been conquered in the traditional sense. Instead, they had been convinced that cooperative membership offered better solutions to their existing problems than continued independence. The human had returned to Earth with what she described to her friends as an interesting part-time job, leaving behind a galactic empire that was now run according to principles that most political scientists considered either revolutionary or completely insane, depending on their perspective regarding the practical applications of enlightened self-interest. Khan Forthak, for his part, had discovered that ruling through cooperation rather than conquest was considerably more challenging than traditional imperial administration, but also significantly more intellectually stimulating. His compound eyes had developed what his medical staff described as a chronic gleam of satisfaction that suggested he was enjoying the experience of governing an empire that operated according to principles his enemies couldn't predict. The universe, it seemed, had been conquered not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through the revolutionary concept of asking people what they actually wanted, and then figuring out how to provide it more efficiently than anyone else. It was, as the human had observed, a much more sustainable approach to galactic domination than the traditional alternative. And if occasionally the Khan found himself wondering whether he had given away his empire or simply discovered a more effective way to expand it, well, that was exactly the kind of productive uncertainty that made effective leadership possible.